Scheibel. Schneck. St. John. Mr. Turner.
Yes.
Mr. Walker.
And then
Ralston.
guilty as charged. Pretty scared the law professor.
So how are y'all feeling about the exam next week?
Not great.
Well, it's coming fast.
Good? Not good.
I'm sick of the anxiety.
Who said good? What? Who knows what they're doing? That's not good.
Well, you never had your test, of course.
Yeah, so really that's not what we're doing.
I didn't know what's the
Multiple choice, short answer.
Oh, it's multiple choice?
Some.
Is it going to be mostly like concepts? Are we going to have to like replicate timelines?
Both. Mostly concepts, right? Mostly concepts, rules, doctrines. But yeah, you'll have to replicate some of the stuff. Here, the thing is, I'm really worried about this class. I'm not worried about either of my other two classes.
Ouch.
I feel like they're really, being honest with you. But they seem really on track and ready to go next Wednesday. But the reason that I'm not feeling good about this class is not your fault. Because I've asked you guys to take a day off just so I could go do a speaking obligation. But what I'm leery about is we're not going to be together for a whole week. We're not going to see each other, and then y'all are going to walk in and take that exam cold on Thursday, which I don't feel very good about. And so I'm thinking about having that. Let's see what you think about this. Having that day, we'll finish up prior restraints today. Y'all will have off Tuesday. I mean, I'm the one who, you're doing me a favor, right? I'm not doing you a favor. You're doing me a favor because I want to go speak at UNC. So then we'll do our in-class together review on Thursday, and then you'll have the weekend to study, and then you won't do the exam until Tuesday.
Yes.
Would everybody feel better? Who wants to do that? We're just gonna have to move everything back. We're just gonna have to move everything back. We'll worry about exam 2 after we got to exam 1. No, because I already feel like there's too much on this exam. All right, so now that that's done, and now that our business meeting is over, let's start class now.
What's the date on that?
It's whatever that following Tuesday is. The first. All right, here's what I want to do. I want, in a sense, I wasn't pleased with how my tape in the other class came out, so I want to tape this, and I want to do all of this all in one lesson since we've got it. So I'm going to do a little bit at the board, and then we're going to go through the PowerPoints together. Okay? And because another thing I want to do is I want to do it on the board how you should be doing it in your notes. And if you haven't been taking good notes up at this point, you're going to be in a world of hurt when comes time for the exam. So anyway, so I'll write it on the board how I would write it in my notes if I were taking notes for this class, and so you can see how you should do it. And I want to make a correction or a revision. I was thinking about our timeline the other day. So the first thing I want to do is make a little alteration. So this is our First Amendment timeline. I want to just make this simpler. Remember I talked about a case called City of Lakewood and stuff. We'll just get rid of City of Lakewood. I was thinking about the Lavelle case. And are you rolling, Josh?
I am.
Good. I was thinking about the Lavelle case and thinking that, I was using that for the proposition, to stand for the proposition that freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right. But I got to thinking about that case, and I thought, that can also stand in for the idea of no licensing schemes ever. Nothing that smacks of a licensing scheme. So I went back and read that case this morning. It's a wonderful case. Yeah.
We only got to 1931.
Oh, we only did 31?
Yeah.
Oh, well, good. So this isn't a revision. This is from the beginning. So near we can say, if we wanted to simplify, what's an injunction? What is an injunction? An injunction is an order not to do something. You are not to print that. You are not to say that. That's an injunction. It comes from a court. I should say nothing like an injunction. A rule like the Minnesota gag rule acts almost like an injunction. It says you can't print this type of thing. So nothing like an injunction. And of course, the near rule told us it was qualified almost never. What is the near rule?
Prior restraints are almost always unconstitutional.
Prior restraints on the press are almost always unconstitutional. All right. And then we said, now, 2 years later, they start analogizing. And we get a case called Grosjean. You can call all these just by their pet names, that's fine, that's what we do. Grosjean. Say,
Is this like when they tried to tax paper and ink?
no tax that singles out, for example, a newspaper or magazine because it's acting like a prior restraint. It's acting like a prior restraint. And then you say, wait, how can that be? We all pay taxes. But this is an instance where a tax behaves like a prior restraint. How can a tax behave like a prior restraint? How can a tax end up being like a prior restraint?
If it keeps I was going to say if it keeps the press from releasing something because of charges, they can't pay
They can't pay it. They can't afford it.
Yeah.
If you're a small newspaper publisher and suddenly the state says you have to pay this, I don't know, gazillion-dollar tax and you can't afford it, maybe you run a small African-American community newspaper and it's not for profit, right? You don't have a nonprofit group doesn't have a lot of money sitting around. And if you can't pay the tax, it means you're not going to be able to print, which means it's acting like a prior restraint. Right? So they're analogizing. They're saying, okay, a tax is not the same thing as an injunction, but it can have the effect of it. Then, in 2 years later, we get Lavelle v. City of Griffin, which is a wonderful case, a significant but forgotten case that nobody else teaches. No other media law teachers in America teach this case except me. Right? And I'm right. It's a great case, 303 U.S. 444, 1938, if you look it up. And it involves a woman who's a Jehovah's Witness, and she's handing out religious pamphlets. And she gets arrested, and they're going to charge her, no, they're going to put her in jail for 50 days. 50 days. Why? Because the town had a rule, the city of Griffin in Georgia had a rule that said that if you're going to distribute anything, any printed material, you have to register and pay $50. There's a $50 registration fee. and she didn't pay the registration fee because she didn't register, and they were going to throw her in jail for 50 days. And I'm making an analogy again. It wasn't an injunction, it was a registration. She had to register and pay the registration fee. And the idea is nothing to make say it like this in other cases. Nothing that smacks of a licensing scheme. So this licensing scheme, remember what did we break away from England for? What was one of the main things? Because in England, you had to get a license from the government before you were allowed to print anything. Do you remember John Milton's Areopagitica? What was it about? It was about criticizing the idea. It was called something like it's about marketplace of ideas, and the subtitle Areopagitica was something like, on the liberty of unlicensed printing. He was saying we should get rid of these licensing schemes. And beautifully, very beautifully, I'm glad you made it, Mr. Harmons, very beautifully in the middle of Lavelle, I see all. In the middle of Lavelle, there's a brief discussion of Milton and Areopagitica. So you see, even we were talking about that early era, the founding era, and those philosophical ideas that come into the founding era. It even shows up in court cases. So Lavelle, nothing that smacks of a licensing scheme. That would be crazy, right? For us to go through the trouble of breaking away from England and then having the same sorts of laws that they do. So you can't have anything that seems like a licensing scheme. You can't have any discriminatory tax that might prevent people from, and then obviously the most serious is when the government or a court sends you an injunction to tell you you can't print something. That's the most serious, most obvious type of prior restraint. Notice it's interesting because we went from, we had remarked when we talked about the 3 legal milestones of 1925 that the court seemed to be moving in a different direction, and it seemed to be moving in a kinder, gentler direction where it was going to start using constitutional law to protect people rather than just protecting slavery or protecting corporations or protecting railroads. And so we saw that shift with Pierce v. Society of Sisters on our 14th Amendment timeline, right? What did we say the significance of Pierce was? 3 legal milestones of 1925. What's on the top line? Top line. The Judiciary Act of 1925, the significance of which created the modern Supreme Court by beginning certiorari, which meant that the court
could decide what
could
cases.
pick and choose which cases it was going to take. Birth of the modern Supreme Court. Middle line, Pierce v. Society of Sisters on our 14th Amendment timeline. The significance was it used substantive due process, but no, we had already had substantive due process. They were always using it right in the railroad cases and things. What's the significance?
To protect people.
They were starting to use substantive due process to protect people, not greedy railroad companies. They were starting to use it to protect people. And then now, Ms. Hollywood, on our bottom line, Gitla v. New York. And the significance of that case was it incorporated what?
States incorporation.
No.
Talks about
What did it incorporate?
something about liberty.
No, it incorporated what?
Due process.
It incorporated the speech clause. It incorporated the speech clause into what?
The meaning of liberty in the 14th
Into the word liberty. It incorporated the speech clause into the word liberty in the due process clause of the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state and local level. Right? Right? So it began the process of called incorporation. The definition of incorporation is the process by which the Supreme Court incorporates parts of the Bill of Rights into the word liberty and the due process clause of the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state and local level. Now, Neer continues the process. It is the sister case of Gitlow because it incorporates what?
The press clause?
The press clause. So Gitlow incorporates the speech clause. Neer incorporates the press clause into the word liberty and the due process clause of the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state and local level. Right? So now we have our speech clause and our press clause incorporated, which means that they can use it. You notice the litigants here. This is a person who is suing the state of Minnesota. Right? So we got to have the First Amendment inserted into the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state level. So the court can do what to a state law using the First Amendment?
Strike it down as unconstitutional?
Strike it down as unconstitutional, and that's what they did. But they have to go through the 14th Amendment to get down to the state level.
So does that mean that in the majority opinion, they have to explain how they went through the 14th Amendment?
No, all they say is, the legal question is, does the Minnesota gag rule violate this person's First and 14th Amendment rights? Answer, yes, the Minnesota gag rule violates Mr. Neer's First and 14th Amendment rights. That's all they have to say.
Oh.
And that's exactly how you say it to this day. So we get Neer v. Minnesota completing our incorporation of the speech and press clause. We get the idea of an injunction is a very obvious prior restraint. A tax can act like a prior restraint, and a registration or licensing scheme can act as a prior restraint. And now we have that tidy little package right there, and we see the court then continuing that trend that we saw in the 20s to starting to use constitutional law to protect individual civil liberties, which is the way we think of constitutional law today. Okay, everybody got that? Everybody with me on that? So I would do that timeline just like that in my notes. And so we said Neer gave us the Neer rule. I tell you what, you know what? It might work better if I just do this like on a Word document. And we said the Neer rule was
Says that prior restraints are almost always unconstitutional.
almost always. Prior restraints are almost always unconstitutional. And if it's almost always unconstitutional, that implies the existence of what? Exceptions. There are 3 exceptions.
They're obscene,
Publications that are
obscene,
obscene
incitement.
And or the violent overthrow.
and do it exactly. The key to note-taking is to take your notes with precision. Publications that are obscene, publications that threaten violence and or the violent overthrow of government, threaten to incite violence and or the violent overthrow of government, and 3, threaten national security in wartime. Right?
So does that mean that then they cannot apply Neer v. Minnesota in peacetime?
You've got that exactly backward, and I'm not sure how you're getting that point. Neer v. Minnesota would be used to strike down any prior restraint on the press unless the prior restraint fit into one of these 3 categories. If the government is trying to sustain a prior restraint against Miss Hollywood, it must show convincingly that the prior restraint fits one of those categories. And obviously, it would be easier for them to uphold a prior restraint in wartime because there is that specific exception in near. If it's in peacetime, it's going to be even harder or if not impossible, right? So you can do those three like that. I'll do a Word document here. So I would say, Near v. Minnesota, 1931, the Near rule, state the rule, 3 exceptions, 1, 2, 3. This should be as precise as possible in your notes. Then, so everything's chunking along. The Near rule is working well. It's getting stronger and stronger with every single case that the court uses the Near rule to invalidate a prior restraint. And then we get the crisis of the Vietnam War. And we get Daniel Ellsberg leaking the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and 16 other newspapers. And then we get the Nixon administration, which is devolving into a criminal enterprise at this point with its illegal wars overseas and its illegal wiretapping of its political enemies here at home, and its burglary operations at the Watergate Hotel, breaking into the Democratic National Committee's offices. And we get the Pentagon Papers is starting to release these damaging documents. We get Nixon in the Oval Office, John Haldeman, or H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, right? Drinking scotch, losing his mind. It's the Jews, John. You can hear him on the tapes. They're fascinating, right? He sounds like a little psycho. It's the Jews, John. We've got to get those bastards at the New York Times, right? He's saying this. He talks like this, right? And so then we have the government trying to get an injunction, right, which is the most obvious kind of prior restraint. They're trying to get an injunction to stop the New York Times from printing the paper. The case is expedited to the Supreme Court, and the court has to answer the legal question: does this injunction represent an unconstitutional prior restraint on the New York Times by violating their First Amendment rights? And the court answers yes. It says that as you saw in the video, the court ruled in favor of the New York Times for them to continue printing. And so, of course, as in any prior restraint case, the majority opinion has to begin by rehearsing Near v. Minnesota and running through all the rules and knocking them down one by one. Is this prior restraint valid because the publication is obscene? No, the publication is not obscene. Will it incite violence and or the violent overthrow of government? Did the Pentagon Papers incite violence? Did it incite the violent overthrow of government? No. And they had been printing them for weeks and nothing had happened. So number 2's out. So then we get to the big one, the one that the government always wants to rely on, national security. And so, of course, the Nixon administration is going to say this endangers national security because you're revealing secret information about the war in Vietnam while we have troops on the ground in Vietnam, and you're endangering them. How would you, if you were the lawyer for the New York Times, how would you try to punch a hole in that argument?
We released the papers and we wouldn't be in Vietnam.
What's that?
We released the papers and we wouldn't be in Vietnam.
Oh, that's a clever argument. You're saying, if we had known this, the American people wouldn't have supported the war in Vietnam and we wouldn't be there anyway. Well, just, you tell me, use your imagination, how would you argue against that proposition? That releasing the Pentagon Papers will endanger troops on the ground in Vietnam?
Could you say how like it's all in the past, like it's like past information, nothing in the future.
That's exactly what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court said some of these documents go back 10 or 20 years. How could that possibly endanger troops on the ground now? And so they start working on this idea of that there's a temporal dimension, that if you're talking about inciting violence, there's that word again, incitement. If you're trying to make the argument that something is going to incite violence or the violent overthrow of government or that it's going to endanger national security, you have to show that it's imminent, it's about to happen, right? That this is an emergency, it's urgent. And with 20-year-old documents, there's nothing urgent about a 20-year-old document. So now, any government trying to argue that it needs to have a prior restraint is going to have to not only get by Nearview, Minnesota, but they're also going to have to get by the Pentagon Papers case, because what the Supreme Court did then it added 3 additional rules. Remember when we talked about Schenck was superseded by Brandenburg, and the effect was to raise the bar so high it made it almost impossible to prove incitement. Remember we talked about that on our types of speech stair step. And when you talk about incitement, you started with a weak ruling like Schenck, and then they raised the bar really high with Brandenburg if you're going to try to prove incitement. So we already had the near ruling about prior restraints on the press on the books, and now the court raises the bar really high with Pentagon Papers. 3 additional rules.
This is New York Times reading.
Yes.
Yes.
So anytime the government is coming into court trying to get legal approval for some prior restraint, the court from the get-go is going to assume that this is unconstitutional. The government bears the entire burden of proof in these cases. If you're the New York Times and the government is trying to get a prior restraint against you, and this goes to court, in theory, you could just sit there and say nothing, right? Because the court is going to presume that the prior restraint that the government is seeking is unconstitutional, and the government bears the entire burden of proving its case to the court. I'm going to put this to emphasize that. Do you see that this is corresponding specifically to one of the near prongs? So it's saying, okay, and government, if you come into court saying that you need a prior restraint for national security reasons, we are not going to give you a pass. We're not going to say, oh, well, national security. Of course, that's very important. Here's a little, this is language from the case. The government can't just come in and say, national security, right? And everybody just drops to the ground and wilts, right? It's not going to be a little magic phrase like that. It's not going to be a free pass. The government must show that letting the publication go, or not stopping the publication, would represent a direct immediate and irreparable harm. And this goes back to your point about these old documents do not do that, do they? They don't live up to that. You see, so this is again one of those cases, just like Brandenburg, just like Brandenburg, just like Miller, just like the RAV case, just like the Virginia v. Black case, where the court makes it harder and harder and harder. It keeps raising the bar higher to make the government have to work hard anytime it wants to abridge your speech or press rights. And this really was, at this point, we're at the apogee of that era that we're going to talk about in a few weeks, about the transformation of First Amendment law during the Civil Rights era.
What year was this?
71. And you can just call it the Pentagon Papers Case, 1971. And this was like the nail in the coffin, one of the major nails in the coffin for Nixon's presidency. The Watergate scandal and this, and there was no way he was going to overcome that. All right, now. So if you take, in your notes, you take the section we did about Near v. Minnesota, the Near rule, the 3 exceptions, and then Pentagon Papers, 3 additional rules. You got it, right? Every prior restraint case would rehearse both of those, like if we had a case going on right now. You'd have to talk about both of those cases in order, right? So anytime the government wants to sustain a prior restraint, it must prove that it fits one of the 3 exceptions to Near v. Minnesota, and if they choose to try to use the national security exception, they must also get over this hurdle as well. See how that works? See how that works? Let's now turn to the PowerPoint slides and go through those together as a matter of review and note-taking, because it'll help solidify this stuff in your minds. So we talked about the difference between a prior restraint and a subsequent punishment, right?
No, we have not yet.
Okay. So the key thing to keep clear in your mind is that since the beginning, we've got this tradition from the British. A very sort of Blackstonian way of thinking about it is that prior restraints are really, really, really bad, but subsequent punishments are okay. So what's a prior restraint?
Preventing somebody from doing something before it actually happens.
Yeah, preventing somebody from speaking or writing before they even had the chance to do it. That's pretty bad. There's not much freedom of speech or freedom of the press if the government can stop you from speaking or writing before you even got to do it. But subsequent punishments are okay. Put that in your own words. What's a subsequent punishment?
Consequence after it happens.
After you already spoke or you already wrote. The idea being that, yes, you have freedom of speech or freedom of the press, but you also have to use it responsibly. And if you don't use it responsibly, there could be bad consequences. What's the most obvious example of a subsequent punishment for something you've written? What's an obvious way that you can get punished for something you wrote?
Like lying? That's like writing about something that's not true.
Right. You lied or you wrote an untruth about somebody, and therefore it led to what kind of legal consequence?
Libel?
A libel suit. A libel suit. So the National Enquirer prints a story that says Tom Cruise is gay. Tom Cruise sues them for libel, and he won $5 million. So that's a real example. So a subsequent punishment like libel doesn't offend the First Amendment. You know, the First Amendment law, a prior restraint is the most serious thing the government can do, but there are lots of examples of subsequent punishments, libel being the most obvious one. And we talked about the three types. We said an injunction or a court order, that's the most obvious kind of prior restraint. As an example, you could say the Nixon administration tried to get an injunction against the New York Times, so that's the most obvious kind. So you could use the Pentagon Papers case as an example. The licensing scheme, we're going to say on our timeline, we use Lavelle v. City of Griffin, 1938, where they were trying to make everybody pay a $50 registration that acted as a licensing scheme. And then the discriminatory taxes, we used as the example. What did we use? Gross Gene is our precedent-setting case. A tax that discriminates against the press acts like a prior restraint. And we talked about Neer v. Minnesota. One thing to remember about Neer and a lot of First Amendment cases is that a lot of our First Amendment heroes are awful scumbags, right? But they're still First Amendment heroes. So Neer was this nut job in Minnesota who ran a little paper, you know, the Crazy Times. And he was on this thing. Now think about when this is, in the 30s, and this is in the years leading up to World War II, and anti-Semitism is the big hatred du jour, right? And so if this guy's an anti-Semite and he runs all these stories saying how the city council has been taken over by the Jewish mafia, right? And that they control the town and all this stuff. So Minnesota had this rule that said that banned any publications that were libelous or slanderous or malicious. So they tried to shut him down. And notice the legal question before the court. Was the gag rule unconstitutional based on the First and 14th Amendment? You see, you have to ask the legal question because you're trying to reach down to the state and local level. And then we get the reason Neer is so important. We knew through common law and custom and tradition that prior restraints were bad, but here we get a very strong, powerful statement by the Supreme Court. Prior restraints on the press are almost always unconstitutional. And then we said there are 3 exceptions. I prefer the way I've taught this many times since writing these. I like them how I did. Obscene, incites violence and or the violent overthrow of government, threat to national security and war. And then we added the Pentagon Papers case. And we know from the video the whole story about what happened. And so notice here, I'm kind of, I'm rephrasing it to draw your attention back to Neer v. Minnesota. So did it violate their First Amendment rights? So what you're really asking yourself is, can the government make this injunction fit into one of those 3 categories? We added the 3 rules. Again, some language from the and just to note here, they tried to prosecute Ellsberg under the Espionage Act of 1917, but they had to drop the charges. The reason they had to drop the charges was because the Nixon administration got caught breaking into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office and stealing his medical records because they were going to try to find some dirt on him to try to smear his reputation. and they got caught. And they were so embarrassed that they had to just drop the charges.
That's bad.
These are just put an X on that. These are just more cases that are examples of that idea of something that acts like a licensing scheme. But we're going to use LaBelle v. City of Griffin. And then here's our case. And so what you should do here is cross those out and say LaBelle v. City of Griffin, 1938, which is on our little timeline. That's going to be our licensing example. And then on this, we said Gross Gene is our example for discriminatory taxes. But you can scratch these are just more examples. Just put it next to that. Okay, so we have Neer and Pentagon Papers Case, which are about obvious prior restraints. And then what we do is we have a couple of issues that are analogous to prior restraints. They can act as prior restraints. And so Nebraska Press Association is about, it used to be very common for judges to kick the journalists out of the courtroom. They would close a trial, or right? They would conduct all or part of a trial behind closed doors. So Nebraska Press Association was a very important breakthrough case where the Supreme Court made it very, very hard for judges to close a trial to the press. Right? How does closing a trial to the press act like a prior restraint?
Allowing them to report on something.
Yeah, I mean, you're straight up not even allowing them to report on what's going on, right? So you're preventing them, you're blocking their path. And so that's how Nebraska court talked about closing the trial in this case. They cast it as a prior restraint. They made the analogy. They said, this is acting like a prior restraint. And we know from Neer teaches that prior restraints are almost always unconstitutional. This is a very important point to remember. Now, we're in a communication school, and we love the First Amendment and cherish the First Amendment, and we think the First Amendment should win all the time, but that's not necessarily true. I mean, when in many, many constitutional law cases, what at issue is two different or competing constitutional interests colliding. And so what we have with this sort of thing where trying to close a trial is we have two very important constitutional issues. We have the First Amendment, free press, but then we have the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees what?
Right to a speedy and fair trial.
Right. So what we have in the Sixth Amendment, we have the issue is the defendant's rights. And that is not a matter to sneeze at, right? You've got a defendant who's on trial for murder, and what's at stake for him?
Life in prison or death
Right.
versus freedom.
Right. I mean, in North Carolina, we have the death penalty, so his life is on the line here. And so obviously his lawyer is going to do everything he can to try to get his client a fair trial, including, if he can, if he thinks it's necessary, try to convince the judge to close the trial to the press, because what is he afraid of? What's that?
The jury or something, you got it, you get from that?
He's afraid of the press coverage poisoning the jury, right, and getting the jury biased. And in fact, let's see, it's funny. Let me just go over here real quick and show you something. I mean, this is a very real issue. I was reading my Winston-Salem Journal this morning, and there was a story right on the front page.
Right there.
Where is it?
The one about the school bus. And he wants the trial moved out of Forsyth County.
Where is it?
I just saw it, and it may be down the page, but it disappeared when he moved. That didn't make any sense. Right there, bottom left.
So here's a perfect example of what's going on. The so the guy was charged that it was a minister actually. It was a Billy Roger Bailey of Old Hollow Road facing charges of involuntary manslaughter. He killed this little boy. He passed a school bus and killed this little boy. And so his lawyer is asking for a change of venue. He wants the trial moved to a different town because, why? Because the jurors are going to be drawn from that local community, and he's afraid of what?
Lies.
Right, and what? The what?
Parents, like, the kids who go to school, so
Yeah, it could be people who are, there could be connections, could be end up being friends and neighbors, you don't know, and the emotions could be running too strong, right? So he doesn't want an emotional jury, and he wants the trial to be moved. And so that idea, this is called the free press fair trial debate. This is back to the beginning. We've been debating this and struggling with this ever since the beginning. The free press fair trial debate pits the First Amendment against the Sixth Amendment. Now notice, nobody's talking about gagging the press here. They're talking about moving the trial. And that's because this is a better option than gagging the press. You see that? It's like, if you're concerned about the person getting a fair trial, gagging the press better be like the last resort. This is a better option. Move the trial to a different location. And so we see that drama play out in the Richmond newspapers case. So it's a small town, just like North Carolina, and it involves a murder in a small town, and the court puts a prior restraint on the press, puts a gag order on the press and says you can't write about this because it might bias the jury. So then the question is, did this prior restraint violate the First and 14th Amendment rights? Because notice we're in a state level here. And the ruling was yes. Again, we get that temporal element. The judge must be able to show that the threat of prejudicing the jury is immediate, it's urgent.
Why do they even allow the press in there? Why do they even allow the press in the trial? Is that like, you have to allow the press in?
We'll come into that. Okay, because here in this situation, the press had already been sitting there, and then the judge decided, that last part, don't write anything about that, right? So they already happened to be there. They were already inside the courtroom, right? And so notice what he said. It kind of echoes that prong in the third prong of Pentagon Papers. He's saying, no, it really must, the press coverage really must threaten to taint this trial. And he needs to look at, do we already have sensational news coverage? And would gagging the press really, if you told, let me put it this way, if you're talking about the trial of the minister who killed the boy because he passed the bus, let's say the trial was going on and the judge said, you, Mr. Deschamps, reporter for the High Point Enterprise, are not allowed to write about today's testimony in the paper tomorrow. Do you think that that would keep people from finding out about the testimony? No, because it would be on every iPhone in the, in the room. People would have already put it out on Twitter and stuff. So it's not going to be effective anyway. And so the point of Nebraska, the lesson to judges of Nebraska is you must consider other alternatives to gagging the press. Notice change of venue. That's what they're trying to do in Winston-Salem with the minister and the bus. Sequester the jury. What is jury sequestration?
You cut them off from outside.
Cut them off from outside. They put them up in a hotel. They don't let them watch TV. They don't let them read newspapers or magazines. And now, of course, y'all have made that all impossible with all of your handheld devices. So one thing when they sequester juries now is they confiscate everybody's cell phones.
I don't understand how that's legal though. Like, how can you tell someone that they can't? I've never understood how it's a question of jury.
Because the court has the authority to do that. Because in our system, the way the rules are written, the court has the power to do that. Just like the court has the power to send a subpoena to you and order you to come testify. Subpoena means under pain, under penalty. You are ordered to come testify.
But at least if you're ordered, like you have the right to just go there and you can honestly, you can put that. Well, like if there's questions, like there's no other option for the press. Like, literally, if there's
Anybody who's called to jury duty can try to get out of it, right? You can like here, you can fill out a form and where you try to be excused from jury duty, and then there are rules about that too, about what counts to get you excused from jury duty. But in our system, we have given the court system the authority to subpoena us, to order us to testify, to serve on a jury. There are penalties in every state for if you refuse to serve on a jury, there are penalties, right? And so we've given them that authority. But you can get out of it. A friend of mine, I've never been called for jury duty. A friend of mine, on the other hand, seems like every other year he gets called, and finally, very exasperated, the last time he was called, he used as the excuse that he had already served on 3 juries. Right? And so he called and talked to the clerk of courts, and she took him off the list because he had already served 3 times. So, if you were on a jury that was going to be sequestered because it was a murder trial or something, you could plead hardship, and they might let you out of it, right? But they'd have to replace you.
Education's another one that works too. Like if you're in college.
Yeah. Okay. Or if you had transportation problems or something like that. But notice there are all kinds of things that the judge can consider before he can or she can consider gagging the press. Put an X on that. I don't like that case. And you can put an X on that too. The point is that when the court orders puts a gag order on the press, we have conflicting laws. We have some court cases that say that have let the press off the hook because they disobeyed, and then some where they were held in contempt of court. And so let's just not get into that. Let's strike that one too. All right. So then we get to the physically blocking a journalist. So with Richmond newspapers, that's a gag. It was a gag order on the press.
What does it say with that little square?
Access.
Access.
Access to judicial proceedings. So with Nebraska Press Association, that's about a gag order put on the press. The press was already there in the room, but it was saying, no, press, you can't write about this. With Richmond newspapers, it's about physically keeping the press from doing its job. Like when the court literally closes the doors and says, everybody out. And so in 80, we get the first important or very unequivocal statement from the Supreme Court saying all criminal trials must be open. Notice the word criminal is in italics. If I emphasize here that all criminal trials must be open, what can you say about civil trials? They don't have to be open. But criminal trials, why do you think the distinction? Why is it really, really, really important that people be allowed, including the press, to be there in a criminal trial?
Because it's someone versus the state, and because of that, they have violated a law that everyone has to follow.
Okay,
And so-
that's part of it. In a criminal trial, the litigants in the case are the accused and the people of the state of North Carolina. It's the whole state. And so everybody has a stake in it. So a criminal trial should be open for all of us to participate in that judicial process, right? The wording in the North Carolina Constitution of 1776 says the court shall be open. Why do we want criminal courts to be open? Why is it so crucial? Think. A civil trial could be anything from, a libel suit is a civil case, for example. But a criminal trial, what's at stake in a criminal trial? Could be a person's life, could be their liberty, they could be thrown in jail. In a civil case, all that's at stake is money. Somebody could lose money. But in a criminal case, somebody could lose their life. And so now answer the question, why do we want people in the courtroom?
To make sure the decision's right.
To make sure that the court is operating correctly and according to proper procedure and the person is getting due process of law. Otherwise, it's a star chamber, right? So that's another thing we're trying to escape from England. Court proceedings that were held behind closed doors with no witnesses, and the next thing you know, somebody loses their head. Right? And we don't know, and the people didn't know what was even going on behind those closed doors. All we knew was that the government came out and said, guilty, off with his head. And so we didn't want that here. If you have people in the courtroom being vigilant to make sure that the judicial branch is behaving properly, that is an example of, it's like a check and balance system at work. So the people being there with their eyeballs watching the judicial branch operate acts as a check on the judicial branch. Why do we want reporters to be there? Because y'all are busy going to classes and watching Dancing with the Stars. You don't have time to go down to the courthouse. We need the reporters there. We need the reporters there so that they can act as our eyes and our ears, right? The press acts as a proxy for the people.
Is it a law that all press has to be allowed, or can they say only state press is allowed?
No. Because freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right, not an institutional one, right? You cannot distinguish like that. And especially here, notice the Supreme Court declares the public and the media have a First Amendment right. Richmond newspapers is not about giving the press the right to be in the courtroom. It's everybody, all people. Remember, freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right, not an institutional one. That comes from Lavelle v. City of Griffin as well. That's the other thing. You all need to go back and write this on your timeline for Lavelle v. City of Griffin. The other thing really, really important about that case is that the court in that case announced in no uncertain terms, freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right. Why is that a big deal?
Because it's the strongest of your rights and it's the most difficult to infringe upon.
Exactly. A fundamental personal right is the strongest type of right. Why is that?
It's written in the bill.
Can I just move on with it?
That's a natural right.
It's actually written.
It's what?
It's actually written in the bill of rights.
It's actually written in the Bill of Rights or in the Constitution. It's actually named by name. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. It's right there. It's not like privacy. Privacy isn't anywhere in the Constitution or Bill of Rights. But so a fundamental personal right is the strongest type of right because it is named in the Constitution or Bill of Rights. And that's why that's another reason that case is so important as well. Freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right. There's a second part to it, and this is on your list. 3 bedrock principles of First Amendment jurisprudence. Number 1, freedom of what?
The First Amendment is not a shield against laws of general applicability.
That's number 2. Number 1, First Amendment protection is not absolute. Number 2, First Amendment is not a shield against laws of general applicability. Number 3, freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right, not an institutional one. You do not have to be a reporter for the New York Times to enjoy freedom of the press. Each of us gets that. Right? That's what I'm going to UNC Law School next week to speak about. Right? Everybody got those in their notes? The 3 bedrock principles? Okay. So again, just like these parallel, just like with Nebraska, what Richmond teaches is that the court must think about doing something else. Right? Because the First Amendment is skeptical that barring the press from the courtroom would actually achieve what the judge's goal is, which is a fairer trial. And this says cameras in the courtroom. And so again, we're making the analogy here. The near rule about how bad prior restraints are, you see it's starting to grow and branch out to other issues. So now what we're saying here is, if you bar cameras from the courtroom, that also acts like a prior restraint. Are any visual people here? Camera people? Video people? Well, if you're a videographer and you are barred from going to the thing that you were trying to record on, isn't that pretty much a prior restraint keeping you from broadcasting? And now you guys will be upset. Everybody, all the video people, camera people were hoping that this would be your Richmond newspapers, but it wasn't. So the court said, the Supreme Court said, federal courts are under no obligation to let cameras in. It's completely up to the judge. And of course, you do have some places where it's more likely to be allowed than others. Florida, Arizona, and California are probably the 3 most lenient states about allowing cameras in the courtroom. Otherwise, you wouldn't have court TV, right? So you got to get the footage from somewhere. But you're not going to get it from North Carolina, because North Carolina courts are dead set against having cameras in the courtroom. That's why here, it's another example of why it's a legal rule that shapes what you see in here. If you're watching the news and they're talking about a trial and they just show those drawings, that's why. You can't have a camera in the courtroom, and so they'll have an artist make little sketches, and you see them on the TV news. They put up those little sketches. So they said federal courts under no obligation, and judges can decide. And then as far as the state courts, the Supreme Court said we're not going to make any decision for the states. Each state can decide on its own. So wherever you visual people work, you've got to be aware of what the rules in your state are. In North Carolina, the rule that the General Assembly wrote, it's very simple. It just says it is 100% up to the discretion of the judge. The judge gets to decide. Chandler v. Florida, very important case. And there we are on that. So we go from the important rule in near that starts to spread out. Like if I were studying and thinking about this and rehearsing, I would say, all right, we go from near, which is about an injunction, which is a very obvious prior restraint. Then we go to Grosjean, a discriminatory tax, which can act like a prior restraint. Then we go to Lavelle, which is a kind of registration or something that seems like a licensing scheme, which can also act like a prior restraint. Then we can go to a gag order on the press in a judicial setting, can act as a prior restraint. Then we can come closing the doors of a judicial proceeding, can also act like a prior restraint. And then barring cameras and video recorders from a courtroom can also act like a prior restraint. You see that? And because if you look at those dates, you see the law like sort of marching forward through time as that concept from near starts to spread. The idea that a prior restraint is the worst thing that you can do under the First Amendment. Are we together? Do you feel like your note-taking is getting more expert as we go along?
Yes.
So if we're agreed then that next Tuesday y'all are going to study for the exam, you know what I can do too? Do you want me to ask, I'll ask Kara, we have a tutor for this class, right? Kara Reed. Anybody know Kara? Kara Reed is the tutor for this class. I'll ask her what her schedule is like next Tuesday, and if she has time to meet with folks and stuff. Since you're going to have this class time open to yourself, I'll ask Kara if she can make herself available. Would that be good?
Oh, yeah.
During this class time, or just in general?
What do you think? Would you guys like me to see if, all right, because this is a big chunk of time, let me see if Kara has time during this class time, since y'all are presumably going to be free, where she can come here for maybe 30 or 45 minutes, and y'all can even have kind of a group powwow with her, and she can coach you about how to get ready, what you should study, what would be the way. Okay, that's the deal. And then Thursday, we'll improvise and figure it out. I mean, I don't know. I'm of two minds about it, but I want to lean on the side of being more generous. I think you would be ready to take the exam on Thursday, but like I said, I'm inclined to be more generous about it and move the exam back. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Yes, do that?
Yeah.
All right. Well, then since we're doing that, we'll study next time when we come back. Let's go ahead and break early today.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
I'll just review you.
Wait, y'all.
Do we need to come in Thursday with questions that they'll ask, or are we going to just generally everything?
No, with questions, and I was even kind of thinking of coming, I want to come up with a way.
Because I know that, of course, there will be some questions that I can ask that people that have been doing that. There's a lot of.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
All right.